Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the fair, or welcome to the 2020 Brooklyn Antiquarian Book Fair. If you haven't been before, our address to go and visit the fair is brooklynbookfair.com, and you can follow the link that takes you to the virtual fair. I'm your director of programming and host for the day, and also yesterday. My name is Brian Chittister, and I will introduce the current speaker as well as the two that are coming up later today. And we hope you'll tune in and stay with us as well as enjoy the fair. And so a few technical things. One, for each of these presentations, if you have any questions, leave your comments in the chat box to your right, my left, your right in YouTube. So, and we will have a Q&A with this speaker as well as the rest afterwards. I just want to say a few words before I introduce the speaker. Yesterday, we had some speakers talk about their experiences, their horrendous experiences with moving to New York, and all of us have gone through that. And my own sob story sort of coincides with how I met Matt Marello, who is the speaker that I'm going to bring on in a minute here. But I moved to New York in 2011 and had almost immediately a serious health crisis while also trying to acclimate to all the various ways that you can get parking tickets or, whatever. And after I had gotten through my experience at the hospital, I started writing regularly for the American Prospect and the Village Voice and a few articles for the Atlantic, and things were starting to settle down. I was writing regular art gallery reviews and artist profiles. And I went into a gallery in Brooklyn called Pierogi 2000, which is now in Lower Manhattan. And I saw on the walls these very psychedelic meets medieval looking images that, immediately caught my attention. And I walked up to them, and after I started looking at them more closely, I said, these don't have like medieval icon figures in them or whatever. They look like something out of, Mad Magazine or Zap Comics or whatever. So there was all these, surf finks and flying chimera that were having this kind of out of body or transcendent experience. And I just was blown away by the imagery. I turned the corner into the next room, and stapled to the wall was all these pieces of paper about arcane subjects and weird esoteric inquiries and things like that. And stamped on the wall were these blue stamps that I had recognized in the paintings. And it looked like it was the basement of some, paranoid conspiracy theorist. And so I asked the gallerist, I was like, who is this guy and what's his story? I mean, I was just so intrigued. And he told me his name was Matt Marello, and he has a studio around the block. And so he called him, and Matt came down, and I ended up writing several articles about Matt's work and also doing a short documentary about him, and have only become more intrigued by his story and his art over the years. So I'm extremely proud and pleased to have him give this presentation today. And I know it's going to blow everybody's mind. So without further ado, take it away, Matt.
Okay, so here we go. I'll put the first card up. Okay. Okay, so you could go to the first card, Nico.
It's there.
Oh, the second one, I'm sorry. Okay. So I know this is going to sound a bit weird, but I had a very odd thing happen to me when I was 18 years old. It was the summer of 1979, and I was home from my first year of college. I was standing in my family's TV room talking to a friend when I experienced an extremely abrupt and vivid hallucination. Although I was aware I was still standing in the middle of the room, my mind suddenly entered an immense black space. The space seemed infinite and devoid of absolutely anything except one thing. Floating in the middle of the void were two luminous parallel circles. They glowed a most beautiful aquamarine blue. The two circles were set apart from each other and skewed at an angle so that one of the circles, from my perspective, was halfway in front of the other. Each circle was exactly the same as the other, a mirror image, and although they were distinct, their proximity and self-reflective quality made them seem like they were one structure. They were strangely cool, powerful, and serene, and appeared to be composed entirely of light. There was no sense of scale, no point of reference, and there was no sound or any movement. As quickly as the hallucination had begun, it was over. It lasted only a split second, but while it happened, I had no sense of time. I was suddenly back in the room again, and my friend was still talking to me as if nothing had happened. I immediately blurted out, "Did you see that?" I looked him straight in the eyes. I wanted him to say yes, but he looked back at me, completely dumbfounded. "Did you see that?" I asked again. When I realized he had no idea what I was talking about, I quickly ran to get a piece of paper and a pencil. I needed to draw what I had seen. Okay, next slide, please. This is the drawing I made that day. Funny enough, I had just finished my first year of art school, and one of the classes I took was projective geometry. I had to tinker with the formula over and over again until I finally hit upon the correct perspective. But the luminous beauty of the circles is something I could never, ever capture. Next slide. At the end of the summer, I went back to school and quickly fell back into my routine. One day, while I was poking around a local bookstore in downtown Philadelphia, I spotted a book sitting on top of one of the stacks called Angels by Peter Lamborn Wilson. For some reason, I picked up the book and started flipping through the pages, when suddenly I saw an image that looked remarkably similar to the object I had seen in my hallucination. Here was a being with 6 huge wings surrounding its body and its face, its hands outstretched, with 2 flaming wheels floating at its feet. The caption read, "6th century bronze mirror found in Aleppo, a seraph surrounded by 2 fiery Ophanim." My heart started to race as I flipped through the pages, hoping to find a similar image. And then, there on another page, were 2 interlocking circles with eyes and wings. The caption read, "Wheels or Thrones, one of the orders of angels," from an 1886 book called Christian Iconography. I immediately bought the book. The next day, I went to the main branch of the Philadelphia Public Library and found a copy of the book Christian Iconography and read more about this mysterious Ophan. The image used in the Angels book was from a church in Athens, Greece, that contained a mural painting from the 13th century. It turns out that these wheels are from the Old Testament and were spoken of by the prophet Ezekiel. Next page, please. I've since that time found hundreds of other examples of these wheels in Western art. It turns out that the wheels are Ophanim in Hebrew, which means wheels, are visual interpretations of Ezekiel's vision of God in the Hebrew Bible. It was written around 500 BC during the Babylonian exile. Ezekiel was standing near the river Chebar when a whirlwind came roaring out of the sky, and, emerging from the chaos, was a chariot drawn by 4 creatures, all having different faces. One human, the second an eagle, the third an ox, and the fourth a lion. Each of the creatures was covered with wings, and beside each of the creatures was what Ezekiel described as a wheel within a wheel. The wheels sparkled like topaz, and the spirit of the creatures was in the wheels. My favorite depiction of the Ophanim is on the top right. It depicts Ezekiel contemplating the wheel within the wheel, and it comes from the western facade of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Amiens, France. Next, please. In 1987, I went on a long 6-week road trip through Europe with my future wife. While we were in Barcelona, we decided to spend an afternoon in the Museum of Catalonian Art. At one point, while strolling through the museum, I turned the corner and came face to face with the most remarkable depiction of the wheels I have ever seen. This amazing fresco was taken from the apse of a tiny medieval church in northern Spain called Santa Maria de Anu. There, on the wall in front of me, were the winged seraphim again, arms outstretched, placing hot coals into the mouths of the prophets to purify their tongues. But the most incredible part of the mural were the circles drawn between the seraphim and the prophets at the bottom of the wall. Next slide. Here is a close-up on the left of the circles from that tiny 11th century church. On the right is the drawing I made in 1979 on the day of my hallucination. The drawings were made over 1,000 years apart. Next slide. After graduating college, I moved to New York in 1987 with the hopes of establishing an art career for myself. One day I was walking down the street and I noticed on top of a big pile of garbage a large black book with a beautiful golden foredge. I thought it was a Bible and I picked it up and opened it to look at the pages. To my utter surprise, every page was completely blank. And I thought to myself, wow, what a perfect book to use for the research I had recently started to do. I eventually took the book to a bookbinder and had the circles stamped onto the cover in gold and began to fill the book with pages and pages of notes taken from various sources. What started out as a mission to find out what the circles were ended up becoming a lifelong project on trying to find out what the circles might have meant. Next page. So far, I've collected over 800 pages of notes, so much so that I had to have a second book constructed from scratch. These notes are taken from a wide variety of sources: physics and philosophy books, religious texts, essays on social research. The list goes on and on. I'm still adding notes to the book to this day, and I don't think I'll ever come to the end of the project. Next page. One of the first things I did after moving to New York was to begin a quest to find out if there was anyone else out there who might have had a similar experience. I felt that if there was anyone out there, the chances were good that they might be in New York, one of the international crossroads of the world. First, I tried taking the image directly to the streets. I had hundreds of flyers printed up and went out into the streets and handed them out to passersby. I was hoping that one day I would hand one of the flyers to someone and they would go, "Hey, I saw that thing too." But unfortunately, that never happened. Next page. I also had some big posters printed up and started plastering them all over downtown. I wasn't quite sure how anyone would get in contact with me. I certainly wasn't going to put my phone number on the posters because what I was doing was illegal, but I thought that if there's a will, there's a way. Speaking of illegal, one night in Soho during the wee hours of the evening, I was gluing posters onto a door of an abandoned building when a bright light suddenly shined onto my back. It was the police. I was given a citation and had to show up for a court date. I ended up having to pay a fine and promised not to deface property again. My postering days had come to an end. Next page. But that didn't stop me from trying to reach out to the public in other ways. At the time, in the early 1990s, New York City was going through a bit of a rough patch, and there were many billboards scattered throughout the city that went unused. I contacted one of the larger billboard companies and asked them if they would be willing to give a local artist use of a billboard or two. To my surprise, they agreed. The first billboard was installed on the Bowery at 6th Street, and the second was installed in the West Village on 7th Avenue. The billboards remained up for several months. I later found out about a billboard competition in Atlanta, Georgia, and I applied and won. I was given a huge billboard off one of the main highways. I'm sure that billboard was seen by tens of thousands of people. Next, please. Another crazy project I did back then was a public access television show. In the early days of cable television, one of the stipulations given to the new cable companies was that they had to provide a channel that was open to the public, and anyone could create a show they wanted, as long as it was not offensive and did not exceed a half hour. I created a show that consisted of only the circles on a black field with absolutely no sound that played for exactly a half hour. I continued to submit the tape over and over again. It must have played on cable TV once a week for over 4 months. Eventually, they got sick of me continually submitting the tape, and they told me I had to stop. One of my final attempts to reach the public at that time came in the form of a window display at Saks Fifth Avenue. I had a friend who was an independent art dealer, and he pitched the idea to Saks, and they actually went for it. For an entire month, several of my paintings were featured in the windows, each of which had 2 glowing neon circles in the middle. But after trying for several years to bring the circles to the public, I unfortunately decided to abandon the project. For the next 15 years, I worked on a series of videos where I would digitally remove a character in an existing film or TV show, and then frame by frame, using Photoshop, insert myself into the video. For instance, one of the videos I made was called The Beverly Hillbillies with guest star Jean-Paul Sartre, where Sartre, played by me, would get into a heated discussion with the characters in the show about the merits of existential philosophy. The videos were a big success. I had lots of exhibitions in galleries and museums, received a Guggenheim Fellowship, 2 New York Foundation for the Arts grants, and had lots and lots of reviews, including one in the New York Times and Art in America. But as the years went by, I started to feel like I was just repeating myself over and over again, and finally decided to go back to my original itch, the one that had been in the back of my mind this whole time. Next slide. Next slide, please. At first, I wasn't sure what to do, but I decided to return to drawing, my first love. When I was in high school, I used to smoke weed and make these elaborate stream of consciousness drawings that made absolutely no sense to anyone. I made strange connections in my own head between all the marks and the odd shapes and the characters that appeared on the paper. I decided to use this approach as a starting point, but this time without any artificial stimulation. So I started a series of stream of consciousness drawings that would begin with the circles in the center of the page and build out from there. Over time, certain shapes and marks and characters began to appear over and over again, and I developed these characters into an iconography that I would use to build into an entirely new body of work. Next page. As I began to create these images, I started to think about all the art that exists all over the world that's been created in response to a story of some personal aberration or an interpretation of an unexplained mystical event that went on to become one of the world's great religions and inspire some of the world's greatest art. Who's to say that something quite similar to what happened to me didn't happen in the past? How do these things manifest themselves? Why do they happen? And what comes first, the art or the ideas, or are they one and the same? Next page. Once I developed the iconography for this non-existent religion, I started a series of oil studies to perfect my technique before starting work on the final paintings. I decided to use an old master's technique called glazing, in which the colors are created by layering washes of color one on top of the other using only primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. A ground image is first created in black and white, and then the washes of color go on top one at a time. So for instance, to create a green, a wash of blue and yellow is applied. This technique tends to give the paintings a certain inner glow. This panel depicts one of the characters that I call the hermaphroditic angel. Next slide. Here's one of the first completed paintings in the series of work I call the black paintings. Here, the circles and iconographic characters float in a black void. Surrounding the circles is an electrically charged branching nimbus cloud with the various characters floating out beyond the central event. You can see what I call the fickle finger of fate in the bottom right and left-hand corners, and the all-seeing eye encased in an Edgerton milk drop explosion at the top right and left. The symbols at the top center, which is read as phi plus 1 equals phi squared, is a mathematical formula that is intimately tied to the Fibonacci sequence, both of which show up over and over again in the inherent growth structures in nature. The Fibonacci series is an area I explore in great detail in my notebooks. Next page, please. Speaking of the notebooks, here's a shot of one of the rooms from an installation I did at Pierogi Gallery in New York. You can see the 2 notebooks on display on a pedestal in the middle of the room, and on the walls surrounding the books are hundreds of photocopies of pages from the notebooks. The notes explore various ideas that I feel are encapsulated within the structure of the circles. They run through the gamut of the so-called great chain of being, from quantum physics to the structure of atoms to chemistry and molecular biology, and up to the development of life itself, the root of consciousness, and the ideas of philosophy and religion, which seem to connect all of these things together and lies at the root of everything there is. Next slide. Here's another image from that same show at Pierogi Gallery. I decided to hang all of the preparatory work, salon style, on a wall opposite the black paintings in order to show the development of the work, from the very first stream of consciousness pencil sketches through the watercolor tests to the oil studies, all the work that led up to the final paintings. Next slide. Since that show, I've branched out from painting and started a series of works that tap more deeply into the history of art, but hopefully short-circuiting the spiritual underpinnings of religious art by using tongue-in-cheek iconography. The first group of work was a series of reliquaries, historically repositories for sacred objects, like the piece of the true cross or a finger bone of a saint. But in my reliquaries reside the remnants of absolutely nothing. I tried to make the reliquaries as precious and rarefied as I could. They consist of a solid oak chase covered with etched copper plates that are filled with vitreous enamel and covered in 24-karat gold leaf. My intent was to make something that would hopefully never end up in a dumpster. Next page. Another piece from the latest series is a stained glass window. You can see the blue circles in the middle of the design. The repeating kaleidoscopic pattern of colored glass emanating from the center is a stylized abstraction of a photograph taken by the Voyager space probe in 1979 of the cracked surface of the icy moon of Jupiter called Europa. Europa is famous for its long lines, pits, domes, and spots. One of the most fascinating features of the surface of Europa are several arc-shaped troughs that form two massive circles centered on the equator. The circles are roughly 1,400 miles across. There is one on one side of the moon and another is on the exact opposite side. Europa is covered with a 60-mile thick ice shell that is separated from the moon's surface by a saltwater ocean. The liquid ocean permits the outer shell to move en masse, and because it is colder at the poles, the ice is thicker at the top and the bottom, and at one point, the ice shell rotated, causing the ice to crack in two spots, creating these antipodal circular troughs. Next slide. I also recently completed a new series of paintings called the Patmos series. This time, instead of the iconography floating in a black void, I decided to bring the images down to earth. By adding a landscape, I tried to draw the viewer into the event and hoped to evoke something similar to the experience described by Ezekiel in the Old Testament. Patmos is an island in Greece off the coast of Turkey in the Aegean Sea, where St. John composed the book of Revelations. Next slide. In this painting, the all-seeing eye hovers above the central drama, and in the center of the sky, surrounded by a 24-karat gold nimbus, are the two circles. In the top corners are two flying, farting men that I call the trumpeters, and at the bottom, two hermaphroditic angels expelling from their mouths a streaming cloud that envelops the nimbus. Next slide. The depictions of the island of Patmos at the bottom of the paintings come from several early Renaissance paintings held in museum collections around the world. The painting at the top right comes from the German National Museum in Nuremberg. After downloading the image from the museum website, I brought the image into Photoshop and removed all the characters in the scene, St. John, the Virgin, and the eagle, and then stretched the image horizontally so that it would fit nicely within the format of my painting. You can see the final result in the painting at the top left. Next slide. One thing that Brian pointed out to me one day when we were discussing my work was how much they echoed the work of artists of the Masonic order. Freemasonry was a direct outgrowth of Rosicrucianism, a spiritual and cultural movement which arose in Europe after the publication of several texts, which purported to announce the existence of a hitherto unknown esoteric order to the world. It was a mashing together of the Kabbalah, Hermeticism, alchemy, and Christian mysticism. I was struck by their use of odd symbols and the bilateral symmetry of the compositions, much like my own work. It seemed as if we were all tapping into similar Jungian archetypes that continually push themselves to the surface in different ages, but in similar ways. Next page. The final piece I did in the series was a preparatory work for a large floor mosaic. I was inspired by a 6th century zodiac floor mosaic discovered in Israel in 1928. The Beth Alpha mosaic depicts Helios, the sun god, surrounded by the 12 signs of the zodiac within the spokes of a wheel pattern that fans out from the center. Beneath Helios are two wheels reminiscent of the countless Christian depictions of Christ or God with their feet resting upon two wheels. In my version, I replaced Helios with the blue circles at the center, and instead of dividing the 12 panels with spokes of a wheel, I separated them with an organic branching pattern evocative of the Fibonacci series and tipped the branches with wide open eyes. The original signs of the zodiac are replaced with depictions of my characters. This 8-foot by 8-foot preparatory sketch was created by hand stamping thousands of quarter-inch colored ink blots onto the paper to mimic the stones that would be used in the final floor mosaic. Next page. I also made several 24-inch square test mosaics using marble tiles and cement. I decided to use a technique used by the Romans to create their ubiquitous floor mosaics. It's called the reverse card method. First, the stones are cut and glued face down onto a flat board with the final mirror image reversed. The Romans used beeswax to attach the tiles to the board, but I used Elmer's glue and cardboard. Once all the tiles are glued down and the image is complete, a layer of concrete is poured into a mold, and the panel with the tiles is then pressed into the concrete face down and left to harden. Once the cement is cured, hot water is poured over the panel to loosen the glue, and the panel is then pulled off, exposing the stones, now face up and secured in the hardened concrete. Next card. Whenever I travel, I always take a stack of postcards with me and do a few handout performances during the trip. In 2014, I visited Turkey and did a performance in front of the Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque. It can sometimes be difficult because most people think you are handing them an advertisement or that you're trying to sell them something. But if you hold the card in front of them and show them what's on it, most people will reach out and take it. Curiosity is universal, I suppose. Next page. Here's a gray-haired me handing one of my postcards to a soldier guarding the Hagia Sophia. I never know what exactly happens to all of these postcards, but I rarely see them discarded on the ground or in trash cans, so I guess the people find them interesting enough to hold on to them. Maybe even bring them home. One can only hope. Next page. One of my favorite things to do is to take a stack of postcards and put them in the postcard racks at tourist shops. I always wonder how long they stay there. Maybe once they're discovered, the proprietor just ends up leaving them there. I can see the shopkeeper looking down at the cards, wondering where the heck they came from and selling them to the tourists anyway. Next one. The most interesting performance I did was at the Western Wall in Jerusalem in 2017. The plaza in front of the wall was teeming with thousands and thousands of worshipers, bobbing their heads and saying their prayers. I was very nervous as I approached the wall and began to press my cards into the cavities between the stones. I was certain that someone would vehemently object to what I was doing, or that a security guard would come up and ask me to leave. But to my surprise, not a single person said a word. I pushed the cards into the entire length of the wall, took a few photographs, and continued on my way. When I came back later in the day, almost all of the cards were still stuck in the wall. And who knows, maybe to this day, there are still a few cards sticking out of that wall. Next slide. This final image is a shot of the work table in my current studio space. Gone are all the concrete and paint. I've decided in this last year, since the pandemic began, to start work on the project I've been wanting to do for the past 40 years. I've decided to write a book. The notes I've been collecting still continue to grow, but I think I've amassed enough information at this point to at least begin the project. I have no idea what form it will take. At this point, I've only begun to extract from the notes the bits and pieces I want to string together to tell the story of what I feel the circles represent. So anyway, that's it. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. And if you have any questions, feel free to fire away.
All right, Matt, turn your camera back on so that we can see you as we do the Q&A. There you are.
Hey.
Hey, great job.
Thanks.
So anyway, Neko, I think you can go split screen between us now, and I'll moderate Q&A. I'll start things off, and if any questions come about in the YouTube chat, then we'll ask them accordingly. That's why I have my glasses on, because I can't see 2 feet in front of my face these days.
Welcome to the party.
Anyway, that makes 2 of us, right?
Yep.
So I guess probably the pressing question I and everybody else has once they see this work is, do you have any solid conclusions about the blue circles, or are there any versions, explanations that ring truer than others for you?
If I think about why it happened, which was always the question that I had. I mean, the only thing I could think of, and I alluded to it when I was talking about the Masonic work, is that, I'm an atheist. I'm not a religious person. I don't really go into the whole mysticism of the world stuff. But when I read um, several books by Jung, I'm not 100% sure that I agree with him, but it's the only plausible explanation that I can come up with that makes sense to me, that possibly it was some sort of archetype that's, in the ether or whatever you want to call it, in my subconscious, that pressed itself into my conscious awareness for a moment. And what it meant and why it happened, I don't know. And that's the thing that I keep trying to figure out. And I don't think I ever will. And maybe it's good that I don't, because it continues, it allows me to continue doing research. And it's been probably the best education I've ever had. Is just, one thing leads to another. You get on the rabbit hole, and before you know it, I'm in all these different areas and disciplines, reading about what connects all these disciplines together, which is, some sense of symmetry and, balance, and all those things that lie at the root of pretty much everything.
Yeah, and that in itself is kind of a Jungian concept.
Yeah.
That there is this sort of synchronicity between all these different spiritual traditions and maybe even scientific or linguistic and certain storytelling. Yeah.
All those disciplines, you'd be surprised. You start digging deeper and deeper, and before you know it, you run into that. And that's the thing that I found. And that's what my book is going to be about, is all the different disciplines and ideas that pretty much rest on that idea.
On the Jungian idea of like the interconnectedness of, basically spiritual traditions. And
no, that's more what the manifestation of that is. But what I'm talking about is the root of the disciplines themselves. I mean, Jung talked about how all those things are connected in some way. But what I'm interested in is what that thing is at the bottom that connects them all.
Right. And, the interesting thing I told you the last time we talked that I found a book called Jung and Phenomenology on the streets a couple weeks ago, just after we had talked about it. And
that's funny, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's weird how
synchronicity right there. It was pretty
weird. But as I was reading it, the author, who was going through some of Jung's different quotes, had mentioned this idea that, linearity and adopting a persona or an identity is something that happens sort of in early middle age for people. And the author's saying, before the advent of the teenager and lots of people having access to college. When Jung was writing, he was talking more late 30s, early 40s, but the author was saying now that kind of identity crisis happens earlier, and it sort of leads to a more you go from this sort of rigid identity that is very rebellious and angst driven to something that is more circular over time. And that was Jung's sort of best representation of the archetypes in general.
Yeah, well, I can attest to that, because I had my crisis period started roughly when I was 14 or 15 years old, and went on to maybe when I was 18 or 19, where everything that I had assumed was the truth or some sort of reality just came crashing down, and I had no idea what to believe anymore. And maybe that thing that I was going through at that time was part of, or the impetus for that experience that I had, because then it led me, after that crisis period, crisis of faith, crisis of pretty much everything, to go on to build something from there that made sense to me and wasn't something that I just swallowed wholesale. It was something that I created for myself.
And it's circular too. I mean, and in that way, do you think that maybe it was self-generated?
Uh, sure, possibly. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's the funny thing is you read about how does consciousness come about, and it's all this talk of like how uh, it's about a feedback system that creates a self-reflective phenomenon, and that goes from quantum physics all the way up to consciousness. It's the same sort of mechanism that generates these phenomena that continue to build and grow and grow and grow on itself. Where it's all going, what direction it's heading into, I mean, who knows? I don't think there's an end goal. I think it's just a process that continues on and on and on.
Right. And in that way, like Jung actually talks about not only the archetypes not being the actual physical symbols that we see, they point to the archetypes, but
Right.
those archetypes are actually ineffable and indescribable.
Yeah.
He even said, like, my word archetype, don't take it as a new sort of dogma. I've
Mhm.
gotten rid of like the singular dogma and maybe opened it up to all kinds, a pluralism of all kinds of different world traditions and religions. But
Mhm.
then now don't take my word archetype for a new dogma and follow it to the letter. It
Exactly.
actually has no meaning itself other than its
Exactly.
limited social use. So it's like the further you dive into it, it becomes more circular until it becomes, basically like a void, a
Yeah.
participatory void, really,
Hmm.
in a way. We Sorry to get so esoteric. I mean, I think your subject sort of lends itself to that, but we do have some questions and I want to ask them.
Okay.
So Yo Pilgrim on YouTube asks, are have you had any more recent visions or messages that have arrived to you?
No, none. It was just that one. That was the only thing that ever happened to me in my entire life that was completely unexplained. But there have been these strange moments, like, a simple one would be like me texting you about something I just read in my notes about Jung and phenomenology, and then you writing back to me and saying, "Oh, I just found a book on the street, literally minutes ago, that talks to what you just texted me." Those kind of things happen to me a lot, and I know that a lot of people. I know that they get dismissed easily as just being what's the word? Um, just happenstance. But I enjoy those moments when they happen because they seem to resonate in some way. And do I take them seriously? Not necessarily, but do I find them something that I should pay attention to? Yeah, because maybe it represents something that's going on psychically with me that connects with something else. Because they say that if you I always say this is kind of weird, but I always say to people, like, if you're looking for something and you just wait long enough, it'll come your way if you just sort of keep your eyes open for it. And maybe it's sort of that phenomenon where if you have your eyes open and you're waiting for something to happen, you'll see something and just go with it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of intrigued by your skepticism compared to some of our other presenters who are full-on practitioners.
Mhm.
You on the one hand, it seems like there's an academic or artistic exercise that's happening here, and on the other hand, it is something that happened to you that is unexplained.
Mhm.
Um, and the only thing that I can really relate it to, which I don't want to get any more new agey on you than I already tend to be, but it wasn't that many years in difference from when the author Philip K. Dick had this vision one night. He was sitting in his bed and a pink beam shot itself into his brain and he suddenly could speak a variety of languages. And he, like you, used his artistic talent to create 3 novels based on that basically 1 second vision that he had. And those novels are also about this sort of deep dive into spiritual traditions and mysticism and
Mhm.
iconography and literature that was related to that. So, I'm not necessarily suggesting that the pink beam and the blue circles sort of suddenly appeared in this epoch in time, the late 1970s, early 80s, and were somehow in synchronicity. But, you know,
Well, the funny thing is from what I understand about what happened to Philip K. Dick is the doorbell rang one day. And he opened the door, and there was a woman there delivering his meds. Like he was having some sort of psychic episodes at the moment or something. He was having medication delivered to his house. And around the woman's neck was this symbol called the Vesica Pisces. And what the Vesica Pisces is, it's a Christian symbol that's used to represent the Virgin or something like that. But the way that it's created is by intersecting two circles, and the space in between, the space where the circles intersect is what's called the Vesica Pisces. So I think it's interesting, yeah, like right in the center there, that sort of almond shape in the center.
Right.
But you see a lot in Christian paintings too, where they'll have depictions of Christ or something, or the Virgin Mary in that almond shape.
Almost like a womb.
Almost like a womb, exactly. Which is, maybe that's one of the reasons that's used to represent the Virgin Mary also. But it's funny that you bring Philip K. Dick up and his experience and how it led him to do things, because it is similar to mine in a way, where he had this experience. But the thing that I find curious is that his experience and my experience both involved two circles. And what are the chances of that? I find that, and that gets back to the whole Jungian archetype thing. Like maybe something pushed into his consciousness that pushed into my consciousness. And why and where did that come from, and what does it mean? I don't know. It's something that he explored in his way, and it's something I'm exploring in my way.
I mean, would you consider yourself by turn, because you are using some Renaissance source material as well as medieval source material? So do you consider yourself like Cartesian or, Galilean or Albertian, where, basically to have a mind is to be a thing. The body is sort of superfluous, and we actually can observe life as in a grid? Or do you feel in some way that we're maybe participating more actively and subjectively in, the cosmos?
Well, here's how I would answer that. Whenever there's a this or a that, and this gets back to what I've been writing about in my research, is that if you have two things that are opposed to each other, diametrically opposed, usually, like say for instance the particle wave duality in physics, where you can have an object that behaves as a particle if you look for a particle, and it can behave as a wave when you look for a wave. And the two are mutually exclusive. You can't have something that's a wave and a particle at the same time. But when we look at these objects, they exhibit both. So the question is, how does that happen? What is going on there? Now the thing is, it's the same phenomenon, but they're exhibiting two different aspects of that phenomenon that seem to be mutually opposed to each other. The question is, are they actually mutually opposed to each other? Or is it because our minds, who are limited in understanding things, incapable of understanding how those two things actually are one and the same phenomenon? And you can apply that to many, many, many different things.
Yeah, that kind of conditional or cognitive bias is an interesting topic for me, because I mean, I guess, my great aunts and uncles and my grandparents would say, you're seeing things through rose-colored glasses, or you're seeing things through,
really through a filter, right?
Partisan lenses. But yeah, that filter plays such a huge role in how we see things in general, even down to like, labeling each other, or labeling things, categorizing things, so that then they become almost like sort of self-fulfilling prophecies. Like if I see myself as having writer's block, then I'm never going to be able to write,
right?
Because I will just always see myself as having writer's block,
right?
And then it becomes impossible to do it. But I don't know. I think it's sort of, to me, the compelling thing about the circles, that I didn't experience personally, but only through your art, is that they sort of, in your art, they're surrounded by all these different manifestations that are apocalyptic or wondrous, or very visually stimulating. But at the center of it all, like the circles themselves are very simple. Like they actually sort of consistently move you beyond what it is that you think you're seeing. They sort of suck you into this vortex that is in some ways like what scientists as well as spiritualists would consider sort of the unified field.
Exactly. Well, that's what I'm alluding to with them being in the center, that simplicity in the center. circles being like one of the simplest objects you can have. You double them up and you make them parallel, and suddenly it implies a growth, and it implies all these an explosion of possibilities, right? So when I put them in the center of the painting, and then there's the, the nimbus and the radiating out, and then beyond that are the characters, I'm implying that those things lie at the center of all those things around it. But then at the same time, like I was saying before, it's a little bit tongue in cheek too, where I don't want to make it seem like I'm trying to, you know, create a religion around it or something like that, because that in a way, it grounds it in something. It grounds it to something that I don't want it to be grounded to at all. I don't want to ground it to anything. I want it to be open-ended. I want it to be open to your interpretation or anyone else's interpretation. I don't want to create a dogma or create some sort of manifesto that people have to read and follow. I'm not interested in that at all, because I think that ruins it in a way.
So in a way, you're sort of liberating these traditions, because I think we do kind of look at like the medieval Christianity as being related to the Crusades and, Inquisitions and things like that, or we look at the Freemasons as being, secretive and wielding this kind of elite draconian power over society. And so in a way, by taking their iconography and subverting it in the way you do with farting chimera and things like that, it seems like it's almost kind of, I don't know, turning it on its head in a way.
Or poking fun at people who take things, or even this too seriously, including myself. I'm trying to keep myself from taking it too seriously and creating an own personal dogma also, which I don't want to do, because I spent years and years in my adolescence trying to get away from that. So the last thing I want to do, and when I say when I ended up building a new structure, it was merely just a structure in which to function. It wasn't a structure as if this is the truth or a reality. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you did have a religious tradition growing up that you broke from.
Kind of. I was dragged to church when I was a kid, and I was, confirmed and baptized and all that stuff. Catholic, yeah. But my mother's still a devout Catholic. She still goes to church, and my father was. I don't think he said it, but I think he was pretty much an atheist also. But he just went along for the ride, because that's what you were supposed to do at the time.
What does your mom think of this?
It's funny. I went to my mom's this weekend to help her work on her shed, and I read through this with her just to get some practice before I did it, and she thought it was really, really interesting. She had a bunch of questions at the end, and of course she was upset that I said I smoked weed when I was in high school and did drawings, which she didn't know about. But, she looked at me like, "You did that," and,
bad boy.
No, she's really she adheres to the dogma, I think, out of comfort more than, and there's a certain sense of belief there also, but I don't think but she's not dogmatic about it, and she's not preachy at all, and she's open to different ideas, and
right.
She's not judgmental at all, and I appreciate that about her a lot.
I mean, Jung took issue with scientific positivism in that he thought that there was certain benefit to it in society, and of course he saw himself as a scientist himself, but he also thought that at some point we would need stories and myths and religion, or at least spirituality, to be the gateway towards healing, psychological, personal healing. We have some other questions here, and we don't have that much time left, so I'm just going to focus on them from here on out.
Okay.
P. Pratt has written a few good ones, and the first one I'll ask you: do your dreams ever play a role in furthering your understanding of your vision?
Honestly, I'm sorry?
Have you dreamed of this?
No, I've never dreamed of it. I went to a hypnotist once because I wanted to see if I could, draw, if like maybe through hypnosis, I could draw it out again and I could see it again. And I tried, and the guy tried really hard, and I really wanted it to happen, but it didn't happen. And he, and I've read that some people are more susceptible to hypnosis than others, and I guess I'm just not one of those people. Dreams I rarely remember now. I used to have really, really vivid dreams when I was a kid, and I would have recurring dreams too. but not so much anymore. I'll wait. If I remember a dream now, once every 6 months, it's a miracle. So the answer is no.
And his other question is technical. He
Mm-hmm.
says, the nature of your mark making seems to use meticulous repetition. Do you feel this serves a ritualistic function? And do you consider yourself to be spiritual on some level?
Um, yeah, I mean, drawing is it's almost, for me, drawing is almost it's like a meditation to me. You know what, like I was describing earlier when I used to draw in high school. I really just I go into the drawing. I go into that world when I'm drawing, and the mark making is me walking through that world when I make those marks. And am I spiritual? I shy away from that word because I think it's just a loaded word. But there was a book written by this guy named Kaufman who talked about how we can rediscover the spiritual through science and through our wonder with nature. And if I were to describe myself as spiritual at all, it would be that way, because a lot of the research I've been doing through the years is really like the universe is an amazing structure. And to just comprehend what small part of it that we can creates such a sense of wonder in me about why this is and how it came to be, that if you would use that as your description to what spirituality is, then yes, I am a spiritual person.
Right. And one time you said to me, I remember that you said, that you didn't really feel that there was a need to define things as being worldly and otherworldly. Like if it existed, concretely. But you would have to admit that there are many things we can't see that still exist.
Oh yeah, my God, yeah, of course.
And
Yeah.
what role would you say that, like, I don't know, fantasy plays in all of that? Because, there does, even just the process of invention seems to be like an alchemy in somebody's mind to actually create new technologies that don't exist. So,
Right.
in some ways, like, nature and science, like, they're giving us information, but something's happening at an unseen level that is impacting us. And in fact, that sort of membrane that separates fantasy from reality seems to be porous, and things are kind of flowing in both directions. I can't remember. Somebody said that. I really.
I mean, if you think about it, are your thoughts real? I mean, do they exist? Yeah, they exist. I mean, and our fantasies, are fantasies real? What does that mean? They do exist. So therefore, if they exist, are they therefore real? I suppose so, in a way, right? I mean, you can't say that it doesn't exist. They do exist.
Could the spiritual be that, sort of in the process of conjuring between those?
Possibly, yeah, possibly. Sure.
Two actually already real realms. I don't know,
Yeah, do I know? Do I know anything really? Not really, but.
So we have some other questions here. Or it's more like a comment from Jeff Fulmer. Venn diagrams, i.e. overlapping circles, help to visually represent the similarities and differences between two concepts.
Right.
And that's interesting because, I remember when I was in Germany a few years ago, I sent you a picture of this wedding ring place, and it had two circles for its sign. One was gold and one was silver. Mm-hmm. And then you gave me a t-shirt with the two blue circles, and somebody asked me, I guess it was like a few days before Gay Pride, the march in Manhattan, the annual march in Manhattan, and asked me if I was going to the Pride March. And I was like, wow, that's an interesting question. I'm just here getting a bagel. And they were like, oh no, because of your shirt. So it seemed to have,
I think it was the bagel.
Yeah. Anyway, it seemed to have this potential political element to it as well.
Sure. I mean, look at the time we're in now. Look at the polarization of America and between the left and the right. And, I don't want to get into politics right now, but it's interesting that everything becomes polarized at some point. And does that mean that that the things are mutually exclusive and they're not something that is You know, they're reflections of psychic states, I think, that manifest themselves in different ways, and they're both real, and they're both something that need to be paid attention to. And I think if we could see that these things that we think are opposites and that we think are in conflict and that we think are diametrically opposed really aren't, maybe that would help make things go a little bit more smoothly in the world.
You know, I don't want to get binary or be condescending in any way, but you know, I did feel that sort of 2 or 3 years after your exhibition at Pierogi, I started seeing a lot more imagery in New York City and in other urban centers that I was visiting that had those same kind of mystical, spiritual qualities, but they
Yeah.
were done in a more urban style.
Mm.
And I thought, you know, Matt has the disadvantage of being ahead of the curve and also a little bit more in a sort of ossified world where, you know, high-end collectors and the type of galleries that you are particularly a part of and the critics that are, you know, sort of moderating these worlds tend to be more, you know, centrist and moderate and you know, scientific positivist and focused on identity politics. And your work, while you could see that, you know, it's very, very open-minded and not conservative in any way, also sort of kicked open the door a little bit for what began to be kind of a reaction to the establishment. And I could see that, you know, people who were creating works like yours, but that had lesser passion, less, you know, immersiveness, were able to catch on. And I found myself sort of saying, no, 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 here was somebody who was really, you know, just doing something that was ahead of the curve. And yet, you know, the other thing was yours wasn't really a reaction at all like that. You know, it was personal.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you have any thoughts about, you know, why, you know, this type of art has suddenly become so prominent in, you see it in graffiti walls and, you know, advertisements with pyramids and third eyes. And, you know, I mean, it really has become very alluring for up and coming artists.
Well, I think these things are cyclical. You know, I recently read a book called The Fourth Turning about how each generation goes through these four cycles, and one of the cycles is a spiritual cycle. There's a crisis period, and then there's a reconciliation, and then blah blah blah. You can read the book later if anyone's interested. But I think these things do come up generationally over and over and over again through history, and maybe we're just entering one of those periods now, or seeing the inklings of it right now, possibly.
Yeah. But is there something specific
To the
to,
time?
yeah. I mean, do you have any opinions about
I
why
mean,
people would
I
be
mean, just
interested?
look around you. Everything's so unsettled right now. Things are really um, unnerving in a way. And when those things happen, I think people look for something that's a little more, that provides some sort of stability, something to stand on.
Yeah. And
So,
also, I mean, I don't know, the past is, you know, such a minefield in so many ways, but if you can find things, and you know, we had a burlesque performer and a practicing magician yesterday uh, on one of our presentations. And you know, I remember, at least in the 90s, when burlesque and when surf music and lounge music was coming back, it was like, why are punks and alternative people suddenly learning to swing dance? And it was like, well, you know, because it was outside of critical consensus. And so there, you know, there was more room to breathe there. The spotlight was off of those kind of like ephemeral and discarded things. And so, you know, I don't know. Sometimes I think that a lot of the spiritual stuff had been so disregarded for such a long time that, you know, even if people didn't become Freemasons
mm-hmm.
as a result of their disdain for things that are happening in current times, they still are looking for things that, you know, they might be able to have their own sort of encoded language amongst themselves, you know.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I don't know. Have you had any response from the younger generation to your work?
Well, no, not particularly. No. We'll see what happens with the next show. I'm hoping to have another show with this latest body of work, and we'll see. What this particular climate now, how it works in this particular climate, and then we'll see what kind of reaction we get now, as opposed to when I did that work before and had that show before that you had seen. So
Yeah.
the times are definitely different now. So I'm sure I would get a different reaction.
Yeah. All right, Matt. Well, thank you so much.
Well,
It was
thank
an
you.
incredible presentation, and
Thanks.
I always enjoy talking to you, and I'm glad we got to get some questions in from the onlookers. I just wanted to tell everybody that we've had some problems with the links in the reminder emails that went out this morning for the different presentations today. And so I would encourage you or anybody that you are wanting to tell about these to go to brooklynbookfair.com and follow the links from there rather than the links that got generated for the reminders this morning. Matt's talk will be permanently hosted online as soon as we're done here, and anyone can link to it and watch it at your convenience. So the chat room will be gone, so just put your comments below. What else? We're going to start again at 1:30 with our next talk. But in the meantime, enjoy the virtual fair. Again, it's brooklynbookfair.com, and click on the link that says go to the virtual fair. We have 225 booths and over 3,000 objects for sale. And on Monday, there's going to be an extra special day where there will be 600 new items, not as part of the fair from Friday through Sunday, that will be loaded just for that. And that's tomorrow, beginning at 9 a.m. So
Well,
thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Neko, and thank you, Marvin. It was fun.
Thanks again, Matt. Great job.
Bye.
Okay, we're off.